Welcome everybody to the first ever virtual technical program for the New York Federation of Solid Waste and Recycling. My name is Luann Meyer. I am the vice chair of the conference as well as the New York SWANA chapter president. And I will be facilitating today really more in the background, hopefully in the background. So most people, thank you if you joined us this morning. Some of these things may be repeated, but as we've given everyone an option that you don't have to attend all sessions, you can pick and choose. So we'll just go through some introductory comments and some housekeeping items as well. So obviously, due to the pandemic, we were unable to hold our in-person conference in May at the Sagamore, which we were all sad to have happen. And then we were going to try to reschedule it for October. And again, that was unfortunate that we couldn't hold it this October. But all associations that make up the Federation, which includes NYSAR, NYSASWAM, and SWANA, all decided that we wanted to put something out there virtually, a technical program that would provide our members, as well as typical attendees, an opportunity to learn about what's going on, because we all know that the waste and recycling industry has not slowed down during the pandemic, and if anything, it's just made us realize how much more of an essential service it is and how important it is. So over the next 3 weeks, we'll have 6 separate sessions of varying topics. We already had one this morning on COVID-19 that went very well, and today we'll hear about PFAS. As registrants, you're welcome to attend all of them or just some of them, but it's very important to note that if you are looking for professional development credits, that you are a registered attendee and you have paid for the registration, and that you attend the entire session. We will have record of who is attending today, and at the end of the session or tomorrow, there will be a form that's emailed out to all attendees that you need to complete, that you typically, for most of you, probably seen this if you have come to the Federation Conference. This is the same exact form that we utilize here. And NYSASWAM is, I want to thank them because they were the impetus of allowing us to provide PDH for PDH credits to the attendees for this. And then you'll be able to email back to me the completed form. Please make sure you sign it and complete it in full. So I just want to also, before I get into some housekeeping items, want to thank all of our speakers today. It's not always easy to, you think you're just going to speak for an hour and a half, but putting together a presentation and doing a dry run as we did yesterday, that all takes a lot of effort. So I just want to make sure I thank all of you for taking the time. I also want to thank Barton and Leachates, as they are providing the Zoom platform for us to use, the Federation to use, because we don't have anything for the Federation, as well as allowing me to take a lot of my time to help organize and put this together, along with the subcommittee that put this together, which includes Rich Bills, Bruce Howie, Kelly Timbrook, Savannah Petrowski, and Lisa Ruggiero. And I'm hoping I'm not forgetting anybody. Oh, and of course, Russ Rakowski. Everybody knows Russ. He, of course, helped too. And if I missed anybody, I'm so sorry. I'm going to write them down next time. So a couple of housekeeping things. All attendees are in mute and in attendee-only mode, so you will not be able to speak. And so you're already muted. We ask you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen instead of chat. The chat box is disabled. So feel free to ask questions throughout the presentations, and the moderator will they will determine which ones are asked and at what time. And then again, this is, well, not again, but it's being recorded today, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to be able to share this at a later date. I think, oh, and I'm going to just do one more thing as moving it up, is I just want to also note that our organizations all have other conferences or virtual events coming up. I'm going to start with NYSAR first. They typically have a conference in November in person, but they have a virtual conference coming up. So you can find information at nysar3.org to sign up for that one. SWANA has a MRF Summit that's also November 18th and 19th, which will be virtual. You may notice that there are some overlap in the dates, but I have taken a look and you can actually attend both. You'll be busy, but you can do it. And then lastly, we will be accepting abstracts for the 2021 conference for the New York Federation. We will be hopeful that we'll be able to do something in person, but if not, we plan to do something virtually. So please get your abstracts in. The deadline is November, the first Friday of November that is coming up. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Rich Bills, who's the Environmental Project Coordinator for Steuben, beautiful Steuben County. I was just down there. It's gorgeous. Their leaves are peaked right now. Department of Public Works, and he's also the president of NYSASWAM. So with that, I will let you take it away, Rich.
Right. Thanks a lot, Luann. I had planned on basically saying half the things that you just said there to introduce all this stuff. So I'm just going to go through a couple basic things again. Reminder, the session is PDH eligible. Attendees who are interested in receiving credits must be logged in for the entirety of the session. At the end of the session, all attendees will receive an email with the PDH form. If you want PDHs, complete the form and email it back to Luann Meyer. If you're not interested in it, then you don't have to deal with the email. And please also note that only registered attendees will be eligible to receive PDHs. So, Rich Bills, New York State Association for Solid Waste Management. We've been dealing with PFAS throughout this industry for the last couple of years. Emerging contaminants, perfluoroalkyl substances, different names that you hear thrown around. It's one of those things that gets a lot of people interested when you start talking about it. Landfill leachates, still existing in different products. And I'm particularly interested to hear what's going to be said today. I know personally a number of the presenters today, and I've heard them speak on this topic before. The guys who are speaking today are professionals. Upon the completion of this course, you should be able to list and discuss the sources of PFAS in waste, describe methods for sampling and analyzing, describe the potential role of landfills in PFAS management, recall what we know and do not know about PFAS exposure pathways, describe implications of PFAS management and MSW, and list some available treatment technologies. So I don't want to get into any more detail here and steal any time away from our presenters. I will move right into introducing our first presenter here. Bryan Staley. We're talking about PFAS exposure pathways. What is the current state of knowledge on health impacts and implications for solid waste management? Mr. Staley is the president and CEO of the Environmental Research and Education Foundation, where he's responsible for managing the development and oversight of ERF programs. He has been engaged with research projects since I graduated from high school in 1994, and his most recent research has focused on PFAS. Mr. Staley received his Ph.D. in civil engineering from the North Carolina State University. So I will hand it off to Mr. Bryan Staley.
Thank you, Rich. Please let me know if I have an issue with sound as we go through this or any issues with presentation. So I did want to start out just talking about PFAS exposure pathways. Since I'm the first speaker of this session, I will just quick overview for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with PFAS, just a quick overview of what they are. They are a group of man-made fluorinated chemicals They typically are described based on the length of the carbon chain of the molecules, which can vary from 4 carbon molecules up to 16, generally speaking. When you hear people refer to short chain PFAS, typically that is describing a 4 chain or a 6 chain of carbon in terms of the PFAS molecule. They've been manufactured since the 1940s. 2 of what we might call the legacy PFAS compounds are PFOA and PFOS, which were phased out voluntarily back in 2006. However, since that time, those legacy PFAS compounds have been replaced by thousands of variants that are still being used today. So just a quick background on that. Why do we even care about PFAS? Why are they being used? It's primarily because of their stain and water and oil repellent properties, which makes them highly valuable for all manner of different products, which I'll talk about in a second. They have been referred to as forever chemicals, primarily because from a chemical standpoint, the carbon-fluorine bond is strong and stable and is very difficult to break down in a natural setting. So that makes them persistent in the environment, persistent in our bodies and so forth. But because they've been manufactured in the 1940s, so you've got longevity, and because they are persistent and don't readily break down, you've got durability. They've been detected nearly everywhere on Earth, including the North Pole, as well as in our blood. So the reason they're so widespread, because of that valuable property of repellency, they're used in a multitude of products. And even though we may not be using the PFOS or the PFOA form today, because the manufacturers have phased those out, they have been replaced with other variants and are still being used in many of the products you see on the screen right now. So why is there a concern? Really, the reason there is a concern relates to some health concerns that were raised a couple of decades ago. And there's been a fair amount of research done on some of the chronic effects, which suggests some implications from a negative health standpoint related to immunologic effects, causing cancer, liver disease, thyroid disorders. And you can see some of the diseases below at the lower part of the slides that are cited as being potentially impacted by PFAS. And we'll talk about, when I say potentially, what that means, at least from the scientific literature at this point in time today. So the basis for the health concerns, and it's important to really talk about where these concerns have come from. A lot of these concerns have originated primarily from toxicological studies or epidemiology studies. There are a lot less epidemiology studies than there are toxicological studies. So to differentiate the two, toxicology typically uses lab experiments based on animal models to identify dose-response relationships. In other words, you dose a mouse, for example, with a high level of one of these PFAS compounds, you see what happens to their health, and then you document that, and ideally there's a correlation between what happens to the animal model and what might happen to inside our bodies as humans. Whereas epidemiology tends to gather data based on exposed human populations. And in most cases, we're gathering information for folks who have incidental exposure from the environment. Typically, we don't dose humans with high levels of a known contaminant. So it's much harder to get that data is the point. So when we look at some of the evidence, most of the evidence does come from toxicology. And again, as I mentioned, it is based on these animal models. But one of the things to be aware of is that what's been identified thus far is that of all of the thousands of PFAS compounds that are manufactured today, they tend to behave very differently in the body, and in particular the animal models. And so that's an important thing to be aware of. You can see here from some of the research that we've gleaned and pulled out that it is distributed broadly in tissues, stored preferentially in the liver. And when you add up what's in the liver, the kidney, and the blood, that accounts for over half of the PFAS body burden. So therefore, because of that wide distribution, that suggests why you see some of these primary effects from a detrimental health standpoint across multiple issues, across multiple organs, and so forth. So one of the challenges, though, in connecting toxicology to the epidemiology is that, as noted by Wolf, which was a paper done about 8 years ago, that the potency in individual PFAS compounds can vary based on the chain length, functional groups, and so forth. So what that basically means is that these compounds don't behave the same way. So when you talk about a PFOA, for example, versus another variant of PFAS or a PFBS, which is shown in the table below, you'll see that there's very different behaviors when it's inside the body. So if you look at that table, you'll see PFOA lasts on average about 3.8 years. It's its half-life. Half-life is the time it takes for the concentration of the substance in our bodies to decrease by half. You may have heard it related as it's referred to for radioactivity, same concept. But when you look at PFBS, that's 28 days. Also note that typically what happens in toxicology is you look at those residence time relationships in the animal model and use that to correlate what happens in the human body. One of the big takeaways here with this is that we don't see the same behavior even when you talk about different genders of rats for these. A female rat averaged 4 hours for both of these PFAS compounds, and then the male rat was on the order of 4.5 hours to 6 days for these two compounds. So it suggests that the animal models may not be good predictors of what may happen in the human body. That's a bit problematic since the health effects are one of the primary bases for why we're even trying to control and treat PFAS in landfill leachate and at the end of pipe or wastewater treatment plants and so forth. So that's a challenge. The other thing is because there are multiple variants out there in the environment, you have these cumulative effects that need to be considered. In many cases, these kinds of studies are focused on a single compound. So that's another complication that can also affect the outcomes from a health standpoint. This table is just to show, generally speaking, of the compounds that have been looked at thus far, what the different residence times are. So a couple of general takeaways we can get from this is that the half-life generally increases with longer chain length. And so long chains tend to be more persistent in the body than short chains, which would suggest that there could be some differential health effects based on the residence time. That research is still underway. There's still a lot happening and needs to happen here to really address some of these questions, particularly as it relates to some of these newer PFAS compounds like Gen X, for example, which if you're been tracking the Gen X conversation, it's a relatively new variant meant to replace the legacy compounds that's been in use for making nonstick cookware and things like that, which we know really very little about, although the science is building on that. So one of the things that came out of the early work was from the C8 science panel, which was established to address some of these health challenges, is that in many of the papers, it suggests a more probable than not link. Now, that doesn't sound like a smoking gun. In fact, the Michigan Science Panel indicated that the toxicology research and the epidemiology, they do overlap, but it does not provide a definitive connection between the adverse health effects in animals to the specific human diseases. That's primarily because of a lack of research and the limitation in the ability to connect animal studies, which are done at high doses, to those at low doses that we all are experiencing today in what we breathe and what we eat and so forth. So that's important to note, is that a lot of the science that exists out there now was done in a way that isn't as representative as the PFAS exposure that we are currently getting as a human population. Not to say that those health issues, we wouldn't see the same thing over time, but certainly what that does suggest is that we need more research to get at this, because that's really the basis for, again, why we're trying to treat PFAS and remove it and sequester it and those kinds of things, which relates to how we deal with things in the engineered infrastructure environment. Specifically, when we're trying to look at implications on human health and the environment, we need to know that. I mean, that's the basis for why we create regulatory frameworks. It's the basis for why we might design a leachate treatment system to perform a certain way. It's the reason we might want to undertake certain remediative actions to deal with that. Because there are thousands of variants, and understanding those dominant in the engineered facilities becomes really important, because it's another finding is that what we see in terms of what's manufactured in the PFAS products that consumers are buying and using may not be the same PFAS compounds that ultimately end up coming out of a pipe, whether that's in a wastewater treatment system or whether that's from a landfill and so forth. So this is a graph that or a picture here that I like, that was pulled from Elsa Sunderland's research at Harvard, that looks at the different PFAS exposure pathways. And one of the things that they did is they performed a literature review, surveyed a lot of the studies that have been done thus far, looking at how we can quantify what we as humans are exposed to from a PFAS situation. They find that there are really a number of different pathways. You can get it orally through ingestion or through drinking water. inhaling it in dust, and then you can get it other ways, potentially dermally, which at this point the research suggests we don't get it thermally, and then generally through indirect exposure, which would be from potentially environmental sources that haven't yet been fully quantified. So from that research, what Sunderland found is that when you look at the legacy compounds, which again, that's where most of the data currently resides in terms of the science, that about 70 to 85% of our exposure comes from diet, which is primarily ingestion, which that's differentiated from what we drink. So what we drink in terms of tap water is about 9% of exposure for PFOS, 14 for PFOA. Inhalation's another 9 to 13%, and then the other exposure pathways, dermal or indirect, is variable. So that suggests, based on the current research, and as it builds, this could change, that predominant exposure to humans really is from our diet. It's from food, and it's from the food that gets in contact with packaging that might be encasing that food. Exposure from tap water and inhalation pathways is roughly equal, but tends to be less dominant in that respect, which is important. And it's one of the key points of this presentation is to contrast where we're really getting our PFAS in terms of our exposure and how we're dealing with it from a management standpoint are potentially going down two different pathways right now. So when we look at where PFAS is coming from, there has been some research that looked at PFAS concentrations in air across the globe, which probably comes as no surprise. It's in the air across the globe. So you can see the second bullet below here highlights some of the concentrations that have been found of some of the PFAS and PFAS derivatives. Generally speaking, urban locations tend to have higher concentrations. Remote locations tend to have lower concentrations, which, given where these PFAS compounds reside, in other words, in consumer products primarily and elsewhere, the PFAS tends to be where the people are. So that should not be surprising. When we look at where PFAS is going, it tends to be going to what many have described as receiving facilities. And those tend to be the engineered infrastructure that handle our wastewater or that treat our water and provide clean water for us to drink and use, or to solid waste facilities. And so, that's been a key focal point, particularly from a regulatory standpoint in terms of where the PFAS are going. But because these facilities aren't manufacturing the PFAS, they're in essence managing the PFAS that's being sent via the wastewater and via the solid waste that's disposed of. So in many respects, they're considered a sink of PFAS containing materials. So because these tend to be highly regulated, it does make it easy for regulatory agencies to look at these engineered facilities as a means to try to control PFAS movement into the broader environment. So we're seeing that a lot from a regulatory standpoint. Now, so what do we know about the solid waste side of things? Just wanted to highlight where the current research tends to be for the different end-of-life options for primarily solid waste. And when you look at recycled materials, we really don't know anything about what's happening with PFAS in recycled materials, other than we do know that a vast majority of PFAS does exist in food packaging. So if that food packaging either is recyclable or if it is a contaminated material that ends up in a MRF and then ends up being processed, conceivably there can be PFAS materials that ultimately end up in recycled materials or end at least going to the secondary processors. And the fate of what happens to that PFAS as it's processed and as it's reprocessed is currently unknown. So that's an open research question. And the extent to how much goes to recycled materials is also unknown. So big question mark here. When we look at PFAS in composting operations, typically we're looking at compost facilities that are bringing in food waste or packaging, or looking at biomass feedstock that might contain PFAS from crops. So there's really been one study at this point that's looked at that, where they sampled 10 facilities across 5 states. And what they found is that compost that was composting food packaging had PFAS concentrations in order of magnitude higher than composting operations that were not accepting food packaging. And the vast majority of these PFAS were short chain PFAS compounds. So that's important, specifically if one is using compost to grow food crops. There has been research on the ag side of things that suggests that PFAS can be taken up by agricultural crops, and it primarily resides in the leaves and stems, which if we're eating lettuce, for example, that could be a way that we could see bioaccumulation occur. So there has been some work here, again, one study, there needs to be a lot more done really to really fully quantify what's happening from the compost side of things. Certainly when we look at landfills, that's been one of the more robust areas in terms of tracking what's happening with PFAS. And you can see results from a number of countries across the globe, and certainly there's been PFAS found in most, if not all, of the landfill leachate that has been sampled at this point in varying concentrations. Certainly you can see a lot more in China, generally speaking, compared to the other countries represented here. But the point here is that there really aren't many places that have been tested where PFAS hasn't been found in terms of landfill leachate. I want to mention a little bit of some work that's been done through one of EREF's grantees at NC State University, looking at what kinds of PFAS compounds are in leachate. And one of the key takeaways here that I really want you to focus on is when you look at the legacy compounds, PFOS and PFOA, those really are not representative of the larger concentrations of other PFAS variants, the 5,3-FTCA and the PFXA, or the PFHXA, for example, constitute a significant portion of what's been found in leachate thus far. Now that may change again as leachate surveys continue. I know, for example, in North Carolina, one was recently wrapped up. And so, that continues across states that we should, as we gather more data, get a better sense for what the profile of this looks like. Another interesting thing that has come out of NC State's work thus far is in looking at doing some reactor studies to understand what's the influence of microbiological activity in a landfill setting. So in other words, as waste is being decomposed, are we seeing more or less PFAS? And what this suggests is for the abiotic treatment, which is all the microbes have been killed off, versus a live treatment, you see a lot more PFAS being released, which would make sense, right? If you have a material that can break down microbiologically that contains PFAS, as the microbes break down that material more and more, it's not surprising necessarily to see more PFAS being released. But this is one of the first studies that documented that we do see potentially a relationship between actively degrading waste and increased concentrations of PFAS. Another focus of this work has been to estimate how much of the PFAS that's in landfill leachate ultimately is represented in the flow rate for a wastewater treatment plant. This work is still preliminary, it's still ongoing. I had hoped to get some updated numbers on this from NC State. They're still working on that. But basically what this suggests is that while there is some variability, these numbers could be fairly low, but certainly landfills can provide some contribution to PFAS from a POTW. But at this point, what's being found is that it could be highly variable to almost negligible up to potentially significant depending on the flow of the wastewater that's also coming into the facility as well. So more to happen, more research is underway there to get that figured out. I'd be remiss to not mention some of the analytical challenges about how to test for PFAS. We're talking about testing for parts per trillion ranges. We're talking about compounds that are also difficult to analyze as well. So that in of itself poses some challenges. But when you're talking about the thousands of variants that exist, the other question is, well, what should we analyze for? So, most commercial labs right now can analyze for a set of 24 compounds that are specified by the EPA. Again, remember, there are thousands of these compounds out there. In many respects, many of the product manufacturers list the PFAS variant as being proprietary or trade secret. So we really don't know which specific compounds might be used in a particular consumer product that could ultimately end up in a landfill, ultimately end up in the leachate. So in some respects, although there are 24 compounds that can be tested for, we're really not completely sure whether they represent the vast majority of current PFAS production that's out there. So that's another question that's another point to make here about the analytical challenges. So some of the key takeaways here about health impacts. The reason that we're even looking at regulating end of pipe relates to the potential negative impact on our health. So one of the things that hasn't been well established is what happens to our health at low dosage levels over a few decades versus the higher levels that have been explored from a research standpoint, either from toxicological studies or even that was done with some of the exposed people at the the DuPont plants and the other manufacturing facilities back in the day. We don't have good science on the low dosage levels just yet in terms of how they affect humans. So it's an open question that needs to be documented more. Certainly from the non-legacy compounds, the other variants that are out there, the Gen X's, the FTCAs, and so forth, not really a lot of research there either. So more research needs to be done to really understand that. From an exposure standpoint, ingestion seems to dominate exposure, possibly from direct PFAS application via food packaging. Drinking water seems to be a relatively minor exposure pathway on average. So in solid waste, again, just recapping, don't know a lot about what's happening in recycling. Compost, PFAS seems to be ubiquitous, but again, where food packaging exists, that's where we see much higher levels. And then the same for landfill leachate. So to that end, one of the things to point out is when we look at the point of exposure to humans, that could be 2 to 3 degrees of separation. And I want to point that out here, for example. If we look at this, back at this graphic again, and where PFAS may be coming from a landfill, which might then go to a POTW, which then is treated and may get released into the environment, which then later may get taken up by a water treatment plant. We're talking about 2 degrees of separation, at least from a landfill leachate pipe, before it ends up back to a point of exposure where it's been treated, it's been diluted, and so forth. So, the notion that landfills are a direct source of exposure to humans is a bit of a misnomer, unless we can document that people who live around a landfill and that PFAS might be in the landfill gas is a possible point of direct exposure. That research is also underway, but has not been documented. But that would be one of the primary issues related to solid waste disposal. But by and large, we're talking about a situation where 85% of the exposure that humans get is through this pathway, through the products they purchase, and primarily the food products they purchase and then they eat, versus about 15% of exposure, and I'm talking about PFOA as the case example here. 15% of exposure is gotten through drinking water inhalation and indirect. So again, if you were to back that out into leachate, we're talking about a few degrees of separation to get there. That's important. The reason that's important is when you talk about what's happening from the regulatory focus, it really is in this area for the most part. We're not seeing a lot of movement, except I think the state of Washington has done some stuff to try to ban PFAS use in consumer products. But the point is that the regulatory focus is basically focused on 15% of the exposure, whereas 85% of the exposure at this point in time is going unregulated and really in many aspects undiscussed, which is, to me, that's a bit of a travesty. There's a lot more research, obviously, that's needed to document this. But certainly, if you're talking about negative health impacts, this is kind of a glaring omission right now in the body of research, as well as the potential regulatory discussion at the federal and state levels. So with that, those are the key takeaways from my presentation. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm happy to address those if there are.
Thanks, Brian. If anybody has questions, I didn't mention this earlier, but there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you want to type questions in at any point, we'll work through questions at the end of each presenter's presentation. And then if we have time at the end, we can potentially get questions to previous presenters. We'll handle questions that way. I don't have any particular questions from the crowd right now. I do like the fact that, we're looking at what the actual health impacts of these substances are. I think it's got to be the baseline for any investigation into them. There has to be some knowledge that shows that there's an impact on people, and then have people understand how that how they will impact people through the pathways, whether it's food, whether it's water, and especially where the regulatory focus should be directed. So if I don't have any other questions for Mr. Staley, we can always move to the next presenters. And if anyone has a question for him, we can address that at the end. All right. We'll get things set up. Okay, so Thank you, Mr. Staley. We are moving into the SWANA PFAS Wiki, and I have been trying to figure out what Wiki means for the last probably 5 years. Hopefully one of these gentlemen can explain it to you. My best guess is that it is basically an accumulation of knowledge on a topic, but if one of these gentlemen can point it out, it'd be great. I will introduce our speakers here. We have Ivan Cooper. Mr. Cooper oversees water and wastewater consulting activities for landfill leachate, power and energy production facilities, pulp and paper, pharmaceuticals, medical waste, chemical manufacturing, primary metals production, and other industrial facilities. He has prepared several technical manuals for US EPA technology transfer program in alternative collection and wastewater treatment, and delivered over 50 seminars for US EPA on wastewater treatment issues. Mr. Cooper is the chair of the SWANA Landfill Leachate Technical Committee, past chair of the Residuals Management and Solid Waste sections of the TAPI Environmental Division, member of the Water Environment Federation Industrial Wastewater Committee, and many other accolades. Dr. Kremen, Dr. Arie P. Kremen, serves the New Jersey solid waste industry and is the national lead for Tetra Tech's leachate treatment and management practice. Arie has over 25 years of experience in the environmental and solid waste industry. He has a solid background in water resource engineering that includes beneficial reuse of reclaimed wastewaters and biological nutrient recovery. And I believe Bernie Rieder will be available here as well. Bernie works with Rochem America and has extensive experience with treatment of leachates, particularly including PFAS removal. So I will leave it to Ivan Cooper.
Okay, thank you, Rich. Hope you can hear me. Wiki is sort of a crowdsourced information location so that people can contribute documents, and it can be edited by some members of the contributors to the wiki. So that's basically a quick overview. As you mentioned, I'm a principal of civil and environmental consultants, but I'm also the chair of SWANA's Leachate and Landfill Liquids Committee. On this committee, we have formed a subcommittee relating to PFAS to prepare this PFAS wiki, this crowdsourced information location for PFAS. Arie Kremen, who is the upcoming vice chair of this committee, has coordinated the technical aspects of this. Also on the committee is Joan Smythe from Smith Garner, Bernie Rieder, who's on the call today with Rochem, and Jeremy O'Brien is the SWANA relationship person in helping coordinate these activities. So as a group, we've put together the bones of this PFAS wiki. What I'll do is prepare a brief introduction, a number of slides showing how we got to this point. Arie Kremen is going to take over and show some of the details of this, how you can all contribute, as well as some of the aspects associated with the technical content. So if we go to the next slide, I have an introduction from David Bitterman, who's the president of and executive director of SWANA, to give us some introduction to this.
With so much PFAS information on the web, it may be difficult for the solid waste community to find specific and relevant information on various topics. The SWANA PFAS Wiki addresses that issue with focused information. SWANA's Leachate and Landfill Management Committee is now in the process of entering data in the SWANA version of a PFAS Wiki. You'll see sections on regulatory updates, treatment and emission examples, PFAS life cycle, safety concerns, compost, waste to energy, and many other posts, along with reference papers and past presentations. Today, you will learn how all of you can help in this important effort. I urge committee members to participate in this exciting, groundbreaking work. Following today's webinar, the PFAS Wiki will be available for members with a sign-up option if you haven't already signed up. We encourage SWANA members to add relevant information to help populate the site so it can be continuously updated to stay current with changing information. Thank you.
Okay, we appreciate Dave Bitterman's overview, and go ahead to the next slide. The technical division of SWANA includes a number of different areas that SWANA members can participate in. The Landfill Leachate Landfill Management Committee has a subcommittee called Leachate and Landfill Liquids that really focuses on those aspects of landfill management. Go through our charge here, and we prepare this on an annual basis to look at what activities we're going to participate in. We look at monitoring legislative and regulatory issues. We work with other committees to help prepare information and coordinate that information. For example, with the Applied Research Foundation, which has many, many other avenues of interest, but they do deal with PFAS. We work with some of the stakeholders, regulators, and other professionals. As a matter of fact, a large number of our committee is made up of landfill owners and operators, regulators, other people that are involved in industry, from equipment manufacturers and consultants. But most of our focus in recent has been on PFAS, the polyperfluoroalkyl substances, as well as other related emerging contaminants such as 1,4-dioxane and pharmaceutical and personal care products. Microplastics and ultraviolet absorbing constituents of landfill leachate. Next slide. So what we're looking for in terms of the PFAS is there's a whole bunch of areas. What are the impacts to the various areas of the solid waste community? For example, is it leachate? It could be in the air emissions. It could be worker health and safety at landfills. It would also be in surface water runoff and groundwater treatment. You know, we're also looking at, as Brian Staley mentioned, that solid waste is perceived as a portion of the problem. However, landfills really should be looked at as perhaps a sink or some way of collecting that and storing the PFAS material. There's a great amount of regulatory uncertainty with the different concentrations, especially in surface drinking water, that's going to be regulated. Federal level is a combination of 70 parts per trillion of PFOA and PFOS. But various states have significantly lower concentrations, and there's also a lot of uncertainty in terms of the analytical approaches for various states. So that's driving a lot of the laboratories kind of crazy in terms of identifying technologies, different approaches to analyzing these materials. But this is rapidly evolving. We see tremendous numbers of articles, tremendous amounts of public information, legislation on the horizon, and this is changing very, very quickly. So we want to be able to share this information with the solid waste community, and that's how we found a PFAS Wiki that's contributed by members and can be accessed fairly quickly, oriented towards the solid waste industry, is really an efficient approach. Next slide. So we looked at some of the options. The Applied Research Foundation is focused in a broad range of areas. So their focus on the PFAS community is going to be very, very limited. We looked at the option of producing a white paper, but that would be a fixed document, and going through the process of having SWANA approve and publish it would be fairly slow. We've looked at a collection of reports, and that's kind of a challenging approach. We looked at preparing a website, and what we found was the wiki would be a preferred alternative that could be located on a website. And because of the activities that can be collaborative, of having a large number of members contribute documents, contribute information, we found that it's fairly quickly changeable. We can monitor and edit it. And the approach to putting the information in there, as Arie will show you, is fairly easy. Next slide. So the objective here of preparing this wiki is that we can focus on landfill liquids for PFAS. We can share information on the technological and regulatory developments, and you'll see some sections on there. We draw from a lot of different disciplines that are members of SWANA. We pulled in information from other sources that had a wide range of information. ITRC is very, very good quality information. However, it's very broad. EREF has a lot of good information, but a lot of it is focused on laboratory environments as opposed to what we feel was real world environments that our members could be faced with. But we also thought that this would be a really good approach for attracting and keeping members up to date and attract new members to SWANA. Next slide. Arie, if you want to take over from here and talk about the approach and the history, and we'll continue with it.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. First of all, question from the beginning. Wiki, that's one of the advantages of a virtual session. I looked it up on the internet well, and it comes from Hawaiian, means very fast. And this ties in exactly what Ivan said. When we looked into our options, how could we collect and present information that is not going to be hindered by the processes that are inherent with an organization, draw from a crowd of experts, which are, or many of them are members of SWANA. That's how we came to the wiki. So wiki means very fast in Hawaiian, and that's what we hope to do with this presentation here, to get you on board very quickly and help us contribute to that, because it is really not an effort driven by Ivan, Bernie, myself, and the other members of the committee. It's the effort of reaching out to the members of SWANA, specifically of the members of the committee of this landfill leachate, landfill liquids committee. Before we got there, yeah, we have an organization that we needed to convince that it works. So we started with what we called an alpha test, built a small wiki on a small website that was really limited to a very small number of active users, built a skeleton, included a resource database. That's what we want also to have later carry on, which is a collection of basically a library that's searchable. We demonstrated the functionality of this wiki, this alpha test wiki, to David Bitterman and Jeremy O'Brien. And the test was successful. They liked what they saw. Understood that we had limited ourselves, so we don't put too much effort into something we know how far it will go. And then we agreed that we would move on to a bigger outreach, to the beta testing, what we're doing right now. But for this beta testing, we first of all migrated to a SWANA domain, because ultimately the goal would be to incorporate this wiki and possibly other wikis that will come from other communities within the SWANA domain as another resource for SWANA members. So we migrated the context that we had prepared, we adapted to a new host. There's a couple of technological changes that happened. And after we set up the new wiki on the SWANA domain, we started recruiting volunteers from our technical committee and from SWANA at large. Because as a SWANA resource, this wiki, the goal is to draw from members who can contribute from their knowledge and expertise from within the organization and write for other members in the organization. So we're continuing the recruiting efforts. That's part of why we're here today. And as I said before, it's part of SWANA, and that's why this at the end is going to be a resource for SWANA members at large, whereas we focus right now on getting our collaborators, our editors, our information suppliers or experts, make them part of our committee, with the goal that they are then a smaller community to be managed and maintained and work together. Next slide, please. So we're here now with this wiki version 2. We set it up earlier this summer. We transferred the information, and we have right now about 40 volunteers. We provided them with access credentials. It's you need to have it's not open to the public in general or the SWANA membership in general right now. We have tied, as I mentioned, you have to be a SWANA member. You have to be also, we prefer at this point to have the contributors also members of our committee. And ultimately the goal would be for this wiki technology implementation to become part and incorporated into the SWANA website. Today, if you would go to swana.org or swana.com, sorry, I don't remember right now the domain, you would not find the wiki because it's still maintained somewhat parallel to the domain. And the full integration has yet to happen. That would be once we decided that we're production ready. Next, please. So Wiki 101, for those who haven't seen that or who have not had to rely on Wikipedia to brush up their memory on occasionally, it's an online collaboration tool. It's extremely flexible, and as I introduced you before to the meaning of the word, it's a very fast way to get information collaborated, put out there, and accessed. It relies on the crowd, that people who are knowledgeable contribute to the information. Other than a website that I've mentioned before that we evaluated, the threshold into adding information is lower. You still need to use a markup language, and we talk about this a little bit later, to format and hyperlink information. But a lot of the maintenance of the links between pages, images, and all that is done by the Wiki engine. I don't know, and it's difficult to tell right now who I'm talking to, but some of you might be familiar with markup languages or HTML. There are others out there, but the markup language for Wiki is much simpler. It's much more straightforward, but like everything that's related to computers, there's a little bit of a learning curve. Each page has associated with it, obviously, the content that's being prepared, and there's also a discussion forum attached to it. So that the idea is that as you work on a topic, others are contributing, you can have a discussion in parallel, and this discussion can then be documented. Why are presenting? Why is this information provided? How do we think it would be a better way to provide this information? So it's both a presentation forum, but also a consensus building and then discussion media. The one thing that we thought very early on, and it's unfortunate that something has to be part of this like this, is that we're going to have a larger crowd and it requires policing. And I put this in quotes because we don't want to be a police. We want more to make sure that certain goals of this wiki are achieved, that we're providing relevant information that experts have vetted and are familiar with. We want to make sure that everything is obviously maintained in a civil way. So every collaborator can basically go in and mark up language, can mark up a page. There's moderators who have certain superpowers, which means they see somebody takes advantage of changing or kicking somebody else's comments out, can limit activities of certain members if necessary. And so far, with the limited crowd that we have, fortunately, we have never had to use that, and we hope never to have been to using that. And then admins have even more superpowers, which basically means they can also provide access credentials and back up pages later on or restore them if necessary, for example. Next slide, please. So now here's where I've warned you before. It's going to be more technical. So a markup language, for those who are not familiar with this, uses certain parts of the written text that you prepare in a report and interprets this, what to do with it, kind of like a command built into the text. Many probably have seen how that works when you get an email. There's a square brackets, mail to : and then your email address, and you click on that, and it tells the computer, open up a new email message and send it to Arie in this case. Wiki uses something similar. And then here I've listed below a couple of examples just to show you how simple they are. For example, you want to start a bulleted list, you do it with an asterisk. You need a multi-level bulleted list, you do it with 2 asterisks, or you add more of those asterisks as much as deep as you want to level your list. Numbered list. All formatting all this formatting is being taken care of by the Wiki engine. So it might not look as professional as some of the websites that are out there and maintained. In this case, we think that's an advantage. We think by focusing on the content rather than on the presentation, we can get more of the information out that we want there. Another strength of the internet overall and then the wiki are links. You can have links to external links, what's called, like I showed it here, it's a naked link. It's just going to appear in the text as a HTTPS link to SWANA. Or you can have like a dressed up link, it's the next one over, that will show in the text up as SWANA, and underlying will be the address. We talked about the mail to internal links. You can make links to internal parts of the wiki. You can make references to images, files, documents that are returned to, but also you can provide links to other parts of the text itself. You do not have to learn all those, and there's many more to it, and I focus here right now on more simple ones. But table buildings, forms, and functions like that. There's a help contents. Again, when I work on the wiki, I rely on the help contents. I try not to learn things, but over time, the more you work with it, the more they become part of your part muscle memory, part recollection. Len, next, please. I don't know if this is very easily viewable, but if you can move closer to the screen, this is the help contents. First of all, they're available in a ton of languages, and that should not distract. But you see below the different categories of reading, editing, advanced editing, collaboration, personal customization. This is basically what I refer to when I start editing and I need something. I don't remember how to build a table. I don't know how I can work on certain things. That's what I use. And I really encourage everybody to use that. And for that reason, a link to the help pages is also available in the left part of the screen, where you can see that then where's helps. And this menu bar on the left and a slightly revised version also will be part of the wiki and is accessible basically from every page. As I mentioned before, there's a discussion tab on the top, and there's some personal tools for later on. Len, next, please. So this is it. This is the main page or the home page of our wiki as it stands as of a couple of days ago. As I mentioned, the focus is not on the presentation and the font and the colors. It's on context. That's why it looks pretty plain. You see on the top bar, the link is llc.swana.org. That's something that the SWANA webmaster has chosen. I don't know why. You see that I'm logged in with my username and password. I'm a registered user. There's the content. And as I mentioned before, on the left, you have the help tools. Next slide, please. So how do you edit the text? So before we saw the product, this is on the back engine, the editing environment. It's plain text. You see the introduction there highlighted with an equal sign before and after to identify it as a level 1 heading. You see that I provided some links, and there's a bulleted list, and you type it in. It's a text editor essentially that you work on online. There's some limited functionality with buttons that basically just cut and paste in certain text elements that you make your life a little bit easier. And then when you're done, you save the changes, and the moment you hit save, those changes are live. They are out there on the wiki. So there is no review board. There's nobody checking over your spelling, your punctuation. It goes live. And that's why it's a collaborative effort. When you put something in, we're hoping that others will review it, help and improve that. Next slide, please. So the contents, what we're having right now, I kind of summarized that, and Ivan went over that. That's what we're providing. That those are the headings that we're working on. We're building up content as we go. The last part that I mentioned on the bottom is the publication database. That's something we had under the alpha version. That's right now in the construction of beta because change in the environment, the language, program language changed a little bit. So we're working on that yet. Next slide, please. I'm trying right now here a little bit. This is the Leachate tab. You see here some of the description of a paper, of 2 papers, I think, here, that we provided. Here are right now the abstracts. Next, please. And we provide a little bit of a style guide. It's provided to be flexible. We try to be flexible, and it's also in development. We want to provide contents and content references. Those are the items that we think we want to have provided here. We want to have, if we have contents, documents, we want to identify obviously authors, titles. I know a lot of us, when we find information, we try to judge the validity, the importance, or the relevance of this information by who wrote it, who published it, where was it, where was it published, what kind of document it is. So that's kind of the information that's going to be in the database. Next slide, please. And one word here that we very early on stumbled on, it's fair use statement, copyright. I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to tell you that that's the right exact implementation. But we have to be careful when we use contents from other sites, from documents, copyright. So we have this language out here, and that's going to, I think, over time is going to be developed and see how it works. For example, one of the things, we don't want people to use documents they obtain from a paid website and post it, because paid website means that definitely the content is copyrighted. Next slide, please. Publication database, I told you we're working on that. We can support the most relevant document formats, and if we need, we can add to that. But we identify basically PowerPoints, PDFs, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, and together with image files as the most relevant and important at this point. Next slide, please. We want to avoid, as I mentioned, provide information with a high information content. So we're trying to focus and remove information that might not be contributing a lot of information. We want to avoid overly blatant material, marketing material, and promotional material, and information that's relevant to the industry. And we also don't want to duplicate, for example, what ERF has on their website and ITRC. And I think next is my last slide. So as I mentioned before, this is by invitation only, so consider this your invitation. If you want, please contact either Ivan, myself, or Bernie. You will then forward that. We'll reach out to SWANA to issue the invite, which will then provide you with the credentials. The only prerogative, the only conditions that you have to meet is you have to be a SWANA member in good standing, and we want you to join the Landfill Liquids Technical Committee so you become part of our community. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ivan and Arie. Again, looks like, man, we don't have any more questions. We have one question. Let me read it out loud here. Are PFAS used more for certain types of food packaging than others? For example, paper and plastic versus glass and aluminum. Not sure which one you want to take that one on.
That might be more appropriate for Bryan Staley to answer than us, but if it's glass, I don't think you'd be seeing that. If you look at the grease prevention wrapping in some, for example, hamburger wrappers, you might find it there, pizza boxes. But if Bryan Staley has any comments, certainly appreciate that.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Ivan. I pretty much would echo what you would say. I mean, there has been, for example, PFAS found in chocolate cake that was made at home, and when that was traced back, it ended up being a part of the packaging that the mix came in, for example. But you know, by and large, the current research suggested about 40% of food packaging contains PFAS on some level, with a more of a focus on I'd say the convenience foods, such as the fast food packaging, for example, or the ready to eat types of meals that already have cheese mixed in with things, or things that could be sticky against the packaging. So there's some work going on, in yet another analytical challenge is how do we measure PFAS concentrations in these upstream products when it's not liquid and it's in a solid form. And that's some work, for example, that Iowa State University has been working on because that's also challenging too. But most certainly your convenience foods seem to be the primary focus of PFAS sourced materials.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. I thank you for explaining what a wiki is. I think I completely understand everything now. So let's move on in the interest of time to our third topic. Our third pair of presenters will be talking about the PFAS study of solid waste materials, which I'm particularly interested in seeing what's in what particular type of solid waste. We have Matthew Estabrooks and Stephen Zemba. Mr. Estabrooks has over 12 years of civil and environmental engineering experience. His experience includes environmental data collection and evaluation, remedial design and implementation, many other things along that lines. In addition, Matthew recently managed a study of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, sources and loadings to the New England Waste Services of Vermont landfill in Coventry, Vermont. The study involved collecting samples from wastewater treatment facilities, sludge, and other waste streams, analyzing the samples for PFAS analytes, and interpreting the results. Mr. Zemba has more than 2 decades of experience assessing risks of environmental chemicals. His projects include fate and transport modeling, exposure assessment, both human health and ecological risk assessments, as well as many other related topics here. So I think this is going to be an interesting one, trying to figure out how it is that these PFAS are getting to us, and particularly what risks there are that are inherent to them. So Mr. Estabrooks, if you're ready to go,
yep.
I will hand it to you.
Can you see my screen okay?
Can, yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the intro. So Steve is not co-presenting with me today, but he's certainly available for follow-up questions. So,
okay.
Yep. All right. So, all right, I'll get started here. So, yeah, I'm a project manager with Sanborn Head I'm at the Burlington office in Vermont. So this discussion is on the waste testing program that Sanborn Head implemented on behalf of our client last year during spring and summer of 2019. And so for any of you that participated in the conference last year, my colleagues Steve Zemba and Harrison Rokes gave a good presentation on PFAS cycling between landfills and wastewater treatment plants. So this presentation builds on that discussion as well. So just an overview of my discussion here today. I'll talk about the scope of the waste testing study, including sampling, logistics, and methods. I'll give an overview of the results and also look at some of the specific details for each waste type. And then I'll do a quick kind of summary of some mass flux estimates that we looked at, and also as that relates to the PFAS sequestration in landfills. It's a tough word. So that picture there, if you're not familiar, is of some wastewater treatment plant sludge getting offloaded at the landfill. So that's one of the wastes that we were interested in for this study. So the scope, so the study was implemented in response to a recent expansion of the landfill, or approval for that expansion, which required waste sampling to identify potential PFAS sources in waste being disposed at the landfill. So in preparation of the study, we prepared a testing plan, which was reviewed and approved by the Vermont DEC before we started the sampling. We also developed sampling SOPs for the different types of materials that we anticipated sampling. And we developed those in conjunction with the laboratory to make sure that we were providing them with a sample that they could then analyze. So some of the waste that we targeted for the study, the sludge materials, like I mentioned, there are a few different types of sludges, mostly those from municipal wastewater treatment plants, which, and then others from industrial sources or paper sludges, even some sewer grit. And so the testing plan specified that we try to collect samples from as many of those different sources as possible. For the other materials like contaminated metals, bulky items, textile covered, furniture, mattresses, carpeting, we tried to sample about 25%, or what we thought might be representative of 25% of the waste stream. So the way we did that was we looked at the number of transfer facilities throughout the state, and roughly 20 or so. So we did a day of sampling at 5 facilities throughout the state. And then the last targeted waste was from specific suspected industries that were likely to include PFAS and commercial customers. And so we did an evaluation to figure out what basically a list of 20 different potential sources that we needed to sample. And for this whole study, all the sources were kept anonymous. So there's just some pictures from the study, give you a little context of the materials we were sampling. You can see some sludge and some contaminated soil being offloaded at the landfill. Some C&D material, it's like wallboard with some adhesive on it, some carpeting, a leather jacket representing clothing, textiles, and then you can see a pile of bulky waste, textile covered furniture, mattresses, etc. So in summary, we collected 100 waste samples over about a 4-month period. You can see the breakdown. Collected a lot of sludge samples. Some of those were follow-up samples from the same source. So some sources got sampled, twice. And I'll go through the results here in some later slides. But we also did some duplicate samples. So about 20% of the waste samples, we collected a duplicate. We did SPLP, which is synthetic precipitation leaching procedure, testing on about 10% of the waste samples. And for those of you not familiar with that, it's a leaching test to kind of simulate potential leaching of the PFAS from the waste material. And I'll show some results of that later as well. And then lastly, we, for QA/QC purposes, collected half a dozen equipment blanks to, as a check on how well we were decontaminating the equipment, and then half a dozen field blanks, as a check on any potential sampling bias from the samplers or the sampling locations. All right, so there was a lot of logistics to figure out and different methods that we had to implement. So as I mentioned before, all the sludge and soil samples were collected at the landfill, which required careful coordination with the landfill staff so that we could be there on the right day and time. Some of these were offloaded at 6 a.m. So we had some early starts to get out there. So the bulky items and C&D samples, those were, as I mentioned, collected at different Vermont transfer stations. And so that was more of a random sampling method. So we, picked a day to go out there and kind of watch the waste be unloaded, and then kind of decided which materials to composite and sample. And the goal was to kind of, cover a wide geographic area throughout Vermont, and sample as many waste items as possible due to the potential, hit or miss. Some items might not have PFAS, others might have it. So just wanted to try to cover as much as we could. And then the commercial waste sampling, that also, we collected those samples at the transfer facilities. And so, again, we had to coordinate with the staff at those facilities to make sure we were there, when the loads were being tipped. And again, they were anonymous, so there wasn't any other coordination with the customers that we had to do. So that picture there is just, one of the transfer stations. So, what the load might look like after it's been tipped, and then kind of use our judgment as to which materials to sample. So a couple pictures here. The one on the left is a sludge sample. So that the method for collecting that is like, sampling a stockpile. We collect about 8 to 12 subsamples with a scoop from around the pile, and composited it, mixed it in a stainless steel bowl, and then use that to fill our laboratory HDPE containers. The one on the right is a textile sample. So what we did there was cut swatches from about 6 to 12 different items, mattresses or chairs, that sort of thing. And then we use shears to size reduce them to so they're about no more than ½ an inch in diameter. And that was per the lab's recommendation. We had talked about potentially using a grinder to process some of these materials, but it just seemed like it would be a lot more time consuming to try to decontaminate the grinder between sampling. So we ended up just going with the shears. So we worked with Alpha Analytical for this waste study. So there's no EPA test method for analyzing solids, so sludge, soil, or the other solids. So Alpha used the EPA method 537, which is for determination of PFAS in drinking water. And so it was a modified version of that, testing for 28 different compounds. And then for the SPLP, I kind of touched on that a bit, but basically involves mixing the sample, diluting it with 20 to 1 ratio of liquid to solid. And so that's an aggressive leaching test that we use to try to get an idea of leaching potential of when that material enters the landfill and is exposed to precipitation, on the working phase. And it's likely an overestimate of leaching potential, but at least gives us a gauge on, to compare different materials. All right, so just kind of a high level review or summary of the waste study. So we detected, PFAS compounds were detected in 95% of the waste samples. And the concentrations ranged over many orders of magnitude. So from about 43 parts per trillion to over 2,000 parts per billion of total PFAS. And the highest concentrations were from bulky items, textiles, carpeting, materials that were likely coated with some sort of treatment, waterproof or stain proof. And I'll show you those results here. And then lastly, the sludge samples, those results range from about 16 parts per billion to over 200 of total PFAS. And we just noted that those were in line with a study that the Vermont DEC did in 2018. So we got comparable results. All right, so these charts, there's kind of a lot to process, a lot of data here. So I'll try to just give you the highlights. So the first two here are the results from the sludge materials. The scale on the left there is the concentration of the PFAS in the material. So you can see the highest concentration was about 270 parts per billion for these materials. See the legend there, those are each specific analyte that was tested for, and they're summed up in the total. You can see PFOS is the red bar, and that was found in pretty much all of the municipal sludges, which indicates that it's still prevalent in household products. And then substitute PFAS and precursors, some of them are called out there, like PFDA, also show up in sludges, particularly in some of the industrial sources. And then again, this is sludge part 2 here. So it's pretty similar to the previous slide, but you can see some sludges, industrial sludges, don't have much or any PFAS because they probably didn't use it in their process. And another note here, one of the municipal sludges here kind of had a signature more like an industrial source, and it's possible that maybe there's an industrial source discharging to that municipal treatment system. So this is the contaminated soil. Just noting on the left axis there, it's about an order of magnitude less than the sludge. So about 27 versus 270. All of these soils were not known to have PFAS contamination. So suspected it's just, it's similar to background levels that have been seen, in Vermont and other states. Likely a result of atmospheric deposition. You can see some new generation precursor compounds like the FTS. All right, and then this is the bulky waste coverings and textiles. Just note the left axis there. It's an order of magnitude higher than sludge, so roughly 2,000 versus 200 parts per billion. And this was generally a hit or miss. Some items clearly had PFAS, others didn't. And potentially underestimating the actual concentrations in some of these items, because we did a composite sampling approach. So there's likely some dilution from those items that didn't have PFAS. And as I mentioned before, the highest concentrations were in furniture, mattresses, clothing, outdoor, like water-resistant textiles, and clothing like tents, umbrellas, raincoats. And then this is the C&D waste. Again, hit or miss. For the most part, it was, we found it in carpeting, you know, likely a result of coatings or treatments. And then kind of similar magnitude as the bulky waste items. This is the commercial waste, commercial customer waste. Again, kind of hit or miss. Total concentrations were kind of similar or lower than some of the sludges that we tested. A lot of replacement or precursor compounds. Worth noting, there's a couple of food packaging samples there, and those had PFOS in them. You can see there number 4 and number 20 at the end. Not a very high level as compared to the other items that we sampled, but. And then this is looking at some of the SPLP results. Again, there's a lot of information here to process, but basically we're just comparing the total PFAS concentration in the solid sample to the concentration in the leachate extract to see, you know, what quantity or what mass of that PFAS leached out. And for the most part, not a lot came out of the sludges. Those would be the first 4 on the left, about, you know, as little as 1%, as high as 14%. The other one worth noting is the one down on the right that says 114%. That was a paper food packaging, and so that you know, basically indicates that all of the PFAS in that sample leached out. And then this is just looking at kind of the mass flux estimates, kind of by waste type based on the concentrations that we measured in the waste study, and then the mass of waste that's disposed at the landfill. So the waste, the PFAS into the landfill is on the left side of the chart. And then on the right side is looking at some leachate sample results. So the concentrations in the leachate and the amount of leachate generated. So if you total those up on the left, it's about 23 grams per day of PFAS entering the landfill based on the waste that we sampled. And then the PFAS coming out of the landfill is on the order of about 1 to 2.5 grams per day. So a lot more going in than coming out. And then important note is the blue bar on the right side is a PFBA, which is showing up in the leachate, but didn't show up in any of the waste that we sampled. So there's clearly another source that is contributing to that PFBA that we didn't test. This is just another way to kind of look at the mass flux estimates by analyte. So they're broken down by PFAS groups with the longer chain compounds at the top, the lower at the bottom for each group. So you can see the ratio of PFAS in versus PFAS out can be up to 1,000 times higher for some of the longer chain compounds. And bars indicate there's more going out in leachate than coming in waste, or at least the waste that we sampled. So just some of the conclusions from the study. So landfills receive PFAS from many, many different sources. PFAS enter the landfill and waste at levels that are much higher than we see coming out in leachate. So the landfill likely retains the bulk of the PFAS that enters the waste stream, at least in what we tested. And then some of the PFAS seen in the leachate are not explained by the waste that we sampled in our study. So in summary, landfills, may sequester the majority of the PFAS loading, although as the previous slide showed, there's greater retention for longer chain PFAS, less so for the shorter chain. And then, there's clearly other sources that we didn't find. And that's all I have. So just want to say thanks to some colleagues, Laura and John, for helping collect the samples. As you can see, it was a pretty dirty job. And thanks to Alpha, and thanks to Steve. That's it.
All right, thanks a lot, Matt. We do have a couple questions. I had this question myself, and one of the attendees had it as well for you, Matt. Basically, I'll read what the attendee had asked, but I know from groundwater sampling, cross-contamination from traditional sampling methods and materials is significant. What level of contamination did your field blanks show? Do you know of any guidance on the best sampling materials for PFAS? So I know just the basic, there's a really tight procedure around water sampling with these PFAS, and now we're out sampling garbage. I think that's kind of the concept.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a totally different ball game, I'd say. The blanks were on the order of single parts per trillion. I think the highest was maybe 7 parts per trillion, which when you're sampling drinking water is definitely notable. But when you're seeing 2,000 parts per billion in a waste sample, it's very much negligible, and we didn't feel that it had any impact on the results. And another note is a lot of these blanks were collected either at the landfill, on the landfill, or in the tipping room. So we weren't terribly surprised that there might have been some contamination just from dust or that sort of thing. And then just the rigorous deconning we had to do to clean out some of these sludges were pretty sticky. So hopefully that answers it.
Okay, great. Now I got another question here. Maybe this one's for Ivan or Bryan. Not sure, I guess both of you could take a crack at it if you're interested. Someone is wondering if we would see more PFAS coated paper packaging if single-use plastics are banned. Is that something that we may expect in the waste stream?
I'll take a stab, Ivan, or someone else jump in if you'd like. It's a hypothetical, but I think one of the things to point out, perhaps that's related to this question, is that there are certainly many conveniences we derive from these compounds, and I don't want to lose sight of that. There's a reason why they were developed, and many of us probably enjoy and appreciate some of the properties. But in terms of single-use plastics, that's I think an open question. The question is, are most PFAS chemicals applied to plastics, or would they be applied to paper products? I would argue, based on some of the anecdotal data, that you might see more PFAS application to paper-based products, such as paper wrappers for a hamburger, for example, versus plastics, which properties of single-use plastics tend to be more non-stick anyway, tend to be a bit more repellent than paper products. But I think that's an interesting question. I'd love to, I don't know, Matt, if you guys got into some of the work in looking at PFAS in the plastics versus paper products in your work, but that would be an interesting thing to chase down and see, what the relevant, concentrations of PFAS are in the different types of materials for the single-use products.
Bryan, this is Arie. We have seen some data, for example, that we're looking at liners, and there was some rumors that liners had PFAS. And what we found at the end, that most of the PFAS that were associated with membrane lines used in landfill construction appear to come from the materials used in the on the machines used to manufacture the liners. So it's not really in the plastic itself. Again, it's HDPE lines we're talking about here, but it's essentially cross-contamination from the production equipment. I don't know if that helps, but that's one of the things that I know about plastics that we have observed in data.
Okay. I get there's kind of a follow-up related question to that, and I'll leave it open to all you guys as well. Have any of you heard of PFAS food packaging ban in New York? And if you have an opinion on it, what would that be? And also, are there realistic alternatives to these PFAS coated food packaging items?
Well, I'll just note, that there are a number of discussions related to banning PFAS in packaging materials, and I think that question highlights a critical question. What are the alternatives? I mean, think back before a lot of PFAS was used. I mean, I think that speaks to probably what alternatives we're faced with. In some respects, it's a minor convenience. Okay, so more of my cheese on my hamburger is sticking to the wrapper that I'm not going to get to eat, versus in some instances, I think you have some distinct trade-offs. If I have ketchup on my dress shirt and I can't get the stain out because it didn't have something, like a stain resistance to it, and I have to throw that shirt away, is that a more beneficial trade-off than still having a shirt with a stain repellent in it that I can get the ketchup stain out and not throw that shirt away? So I think there's some compelling questions around the use of PFAS, just in terms of what impacts would there be if we ban PFAS altogether. And I think that gets back to the trade-off between what are the scope and the extent of the health impacts versus the use of these materials. I mean, there's no question that there's certainly some health impacts. I think where the question comes in is to what levels do they become significant versus things that our bodies can deal with. And so, I think I know that's kind of a philosophical point, but I think that does get to the heart of whether we still want to have this chemical in our society, or whether we are willing to deal with some of the lack of conveniences that not having PFAS would put to us.
Yeah, it's good. You have to figure those things out. That's ultimately, there's trade-offs with everything that we do. Let me see here. So, did you have something? Anybody else have anything to add to that? No. Okay. I've got a couple more questions, but I just want to let it be known that if anybody needs to get out of here at this point, they will still be eligible for the PDH credits. If anyone wants to stick around, there's a couple more questions that I'll throw out to the group. But if you do need to get out, then feel free. Let's see. Okay, there was a question. Is there any data on the air impacts emissions from incineration of PFAS? No, that wasn't really touched on too closely in anyone's presentation, but if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Well, I can jump in a little bit. The answer is that there isn't a lot of information. I know the EPA was pursuing that, and you may have seen the story about a month ago come out where they were working with trying to get some samples done at a Covanta facility to see what the impact of incineration would be, if you could get total destruction or not. But due to protests in the communities around doing that, that testing was halted. So at this point, I do know it's something that EPA's Office of Research and Development is very interested in, but I think with that particular activity being stopped, I don't think we have any definitive answers just yet as far as how successful incineration is at completely destroying the PFAS.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that basically wraps it up. I'd like to thank all of our presenters today for their time putting this stuff together. I'd like to thank Luann for getting this stuff arranged with the Federation. and Barton LaJudas for providing the technical support. A lot of people working in the background of this, more than you may notice. I will remind you all one more time that the PDHs are available. The forms should be emailed following the session, so keep your eyes peeled for them. If you do not receive the PDH forms by midday tomorrow, then you can contact Luann. And I think that may be it, unless anybody else has anything else they'd like to jump in and add. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. I think that's it.
All right, thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.